amendment that was proposed, and then look at trends in terms of what is being enforced in the marketplace, along with also looking at a safe use determination SUD that was issued by OEA, what that is, how that impacts our industry, along with our settlements and some chemicals that were listed and proposed to be listed that'll impact the enforcement that will be coming through in future. Finally, we'll look at the common misconception about compliance, which is not necessarily the right term to use for Prop 65. And then finally, we'll strategize to, or at least share some best practices to see what might be a good way to implement risk mitigation measures for Prop 65. So looking at overview, so again, this was a voter initiative passed back in November of '86, and what it states is it requires you as a business, if you are going to expose someone knowingly and intentionally to a chemical that is listed on Prop 65 list, that hey, this chemical, based on the toxicity endpoint, whether it's a reproductive toxin or causes cancer, just providing a clear warning is what the expectation is, and that would be required when there would be an exposure. So what does expose, how is that term defined, right? So expose, on the right side you can see the definition means if you are going to expose, implies it cause of ingestion, inhalation, contact via body surfaces, so through your mucous membrane or something on those lines, so skin, or otherwise comes into contact with the listed chemical. And the individual, generally, our focus of presentation today also will be on a consumer product, so exposure from the product, but of course that could occur from chemical, could be exposure, could be from through water, air, food, consumer products, or even environmental exposure, as well as exposure in the workplace, in the occupation setting. All right, so it could be any of those. Again, we'll focus today on exposure from products, but just be mindful that if there were exposure in workplace or in a manufacturing environment, that even in those instances, warnings would be required as well. Another part is, the most common question is, is it preempted by CPSIA? The answer is no. It's a labeling regulation, and so it's not preempted by CPSIA. Same thing, another one was, after the TSCA reform, but did TSCA reform preempt CPSIA? And the answer is still no. There was a carve out specifically for labeling regulations like Prop 65, and so again, Prop 65 is not preempted by TSCA as well. Another aspect of it, as we saw, like exposure, so it could occur from consumer products, it could be from environmental discharge or occupational setting. And so as you are looking at an exposure, you think about what is the chemical that could, on Prop 65 that could cause exposure. Is it volatile, which means it could be, inhaled, or is it something that could be absorbed through skin? Or is the exposure going to be something that someone ingests it then through the GI tract? So as you think about chemical, you want to think about its properties, and then based on that, you can kind of think about the exposure pathways. Also think about, as you think about pathways, you'll also think about the exposure patterns in terms of how is the product actually going to be used, where is it going to be used, and based on that also frequency of exposure and use, right? So, and think about, glass and ceramic ware that are externally decorated. We'll see there are many notices for those type of products, and so you think about, coffee cups, coffee mugs, or things like that. Let's say which have external decorations, and so now you think about what potentially could be the exposure pathways, and in this instance, let's say it's for lead or cadmium. So we know that it's not going to be volatile, but it's going to be absorbed through skin, or if you eat something that leaches out into it, then you would get exposure through the GI tract as well, right? So now you can see potential pathways for exposure. As you use it, you can see how it's not just something that you would use it once. If you're anything like me, you think, coffee at least a few times a day. So you have that. So you kind of look at cumulative exposure potential throughout the day. And then along with that, the weight for exposure, right? So I think, as you can see, exposure analysis it can get pretty complex very quickly. And the clear distinction is that it's not really content saying how much of that chemical is in that product. You're looking at potential exposure from whatever is present in that product, right? So that's a key distinction. Why is Prop 65 unique? Because, most regulations are enforced by, the regulators, whether it's federal or state, that have the enforcement authority. So that's still the case. I mean, Attorney General's office or DA's office in some instances would have the authority to enforce Prop 65, but where it gets unique and is the reason why Prop 65 kind of is something where it's part of most organizations' compliance strategies, because anyone can bring a case on behalf of the people in California. So I mean, I live in California, and so I mean, essentially, I can go in if I find a product that was in potential violation, I can bring that case forward through an attorney saying, hey, I am getting exposed to this chemical, right? So that's where it gets very unique. And also, there are no criminal penalties. So essentially, there are just civil penalties associated with the potential violations for Proposition 65. So with the Prop 65, as we mentioned, the requirement is that you provide clear and reasonable warning to the consumer in case if you're going to expose someone to illicit chemical above the safe harbor level. So these, for the most part, that the warning labels have been in the same, but in 2016, after many years of working, Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment under Cal EPA finally revised the requirements and published the revised regulation, which had two parts. One was where it establishes the responsibility within the supply chain, who is responsible for providing the warning, and then part two was about essentially what should go into those warnings in case where you are providing such a warning. So those became effective a couple of years back in August 30 of 2018, along with some sell-through provisions. And also the key part was it grandfathered older settlements. So if you were party of any of the older settlements, so for example, the ceramic ware that I alluded to, or jewelry or handbag where there were settlements were, back a few years back. And if you're part of the settlement, you can continue using those reformulation levels. And also you can continue to use the warnings that were, prescribed in those settlements as well. So that's a key part. So you don't necessarily have to, follow the new warning labels. So in terms of responsibility, the key is that it alleviates the retailers. So the only thing if you're doing is providing your store shelves or you're providing your website as an avenue for sales, and that's the only responsibility you have done. You don't have to create your warning labels. All you have to do is ensure that you have some mechanism to capture the information from manufacturers and convey that wherever the warnings are required. So the key responsibility would fall with the manufacturer and the importer to ensure that the determination is made where a warning is required and where they are, what it is for, and having correct warnings identified on them. There's also a mechanism where it must be the manufacturers have to provide the information through written notice to the manufacturer, to the retailers, and then here's specific information that should be provided, and this is something that they need to do it annually in order to make sure that information is accurate. And also if information changes, so for example, new chemical gets listed or toxicity endpoint changes or things of that nature, then you need to convey that if the warning was provided for that specific chemical. So looking at the content, so this part is essentially voluntary. If you have something where you can make a case that it's clear and reasonable, that you don't necessarily have to use these warnings, but otherwise the warning, the information that is provided, the guidance that is provided by the Office of Environmental Health Hazard this would serve as, being the warnings being clear and reasonable, as long as you follow the font, format, and the content requirements of these. So again, the warnings are for consumer products, which we'll focus on today, but also for environmental and occupational exposure as well. So in addition to that, you also have some specific group of products where there is a very, very specific format for the warning and how the warning should be provided as well. So you can see furniture is there, BPA from canned products, and so on and so forth. So those are very unique, where you cannot rely on the general consumer product exposure, but you have to follow those specific exposure warnings. So looking at the way the warning is conveyed, so you of course have your traditional physical stores. So if you have those, then you cannot provide a general warning for the whole store anymore. You have to provide a warning that is specific for the product. So you provide that as a sign or shelf tag for that where the product is offered for sale. Or you can use an electronic device for providing this before the consumer makes the purchase. It could also be on the product itself as well. If you are providing the warning through your e-commerce channel, then of course you have to make sure that you're providing the full warning, which we'll look at, and the catalog follows the same as .com as well. Another aspect is as we offer product for sale across multiple countries, and also even for the US for different group of ethnicities, you might have information in English and Spanish, or English and French. So you have to be mindful if the quote-unquote consumer information, and there is a very specific definition of what is considered as consumer information, is conveyed in language other than English, that the warnings are also translated in those languages as well. And so things like ingredient list or nutritional information, those type of information, for example, if you have it in, say, Spanish, you also need to make sure that the warnings are in Spanish. Things like brand name, company name, all of those type of things are not necessarily considered as consumer information, so you don't necessarily have to translate them, right? So be mindful of that in terms of warnings would have to be translated in case if you have consumer information in languages other than English. So looking specifically at the content, so this was a big change in 2016, as you couldn't provide a general warning or a generic warning. Now you had to be very, very specific and list at least a chemical per toxicity endpoint. And so at the beginning, you have the same, you have the warning symbol, the word warning in capital and bold, and that's followed by, the specific verbiage over here. And as I mentioned, depending on the toxicity endpoint, if it's something that causes cancer, use the first one. If it's something that causes reproductive harm, use the second one. If it's both, then you would use the last one. And if you have multiple chemicals for which you're providing warning, and let's say, for example, one is only for cancer, one is listed only for reproductive toxicity, then use the warning in C. Again, you don't have to list all the chemicals. You have to list at least one chemical per toxicity endpoint, right? So if you had, for example, lead and various phthalates and BPA, you can just provide warning for lead, and it'll cover you for all the other chemicals as well, right? Because the toxicity endpoint is both cancer and reproductive toxicity, and so you can use D, and it'll cover you for both. So if you're providing the warning which is specifically on the product, you can use a short form warning. Over here, the benefit is that you don't have to list the chemical, so it gives you the opportunity to provide at least a little bit of generic warning. You still have to identify the toxicity endpoint. So depending on what you selected in A, B, and C, and D above, you can essentially select cancer in the warning label here, reproductive toxicity here, and if it's for both, this one. So that's the key part. So as you can foresee with the short form warning, because you don't necessarily have to identify the specific chemical, it's been used across on multiple products, and also not necessarily for small products, but also products of various sizes, including something which would be very, very large as well. And so OEA essentially proposed amending the short form warning. The idea was that the short form warning, the way it's used right now, it's not in, that wasn't the original intention of the short form warning. They were only hoping that it would be used for products that are smaller, and so they want to do course correction and limit where these small short form warning would be able to use. And so the proposal is that you would be able to use the short form warning only where the product surface area available is 5 square inches or less, or where the packet size, shape, or size would not be able to accommodate this full warning. And in addition to that, you would also have to list at least one chemical per the toxicity endpoint, right? So here's just to give an example of what that short form warning would look like. So it's no longer as short as what it was before, even though it's shorter than the full form warning that would have to be required. So again, this is still proposed. There was the OEA had held public session for collecting the comments, and there was a good degree of feedback from the industry. Once they review all the comments, respond to the relevant comments, they'll probably come back with the finalized rules, or they might revise it further. So depending what they move forward with, we'll know how things will evolve. It'll also, the proposal is basically to limit the use of short form warnings in internet and catalogs. So right now, if you're using short form warning on the product, you can use a short form warning when that same product is offered for sale through your e-commerce platform or through catalogs. So it would take away that that flexibility. In this instance, what would occur is now you'd need 2 separate warnings, one for your on product and the other one for the long form warning for your website or catalog. And so that would be a significant change as well, in terms of both the logistics of managing and maintaining, and also ensuring that the consistency is maintained. So again, this is all proposed, and if the rules were to be finalized as they're proposed, the effective date for this would be a year from the publication of the final rule. So if this were to occur, we'll keep a close eye and keep everyone updated. So with that, let's look at what the enforcement trends are. As you can see, in the last few years, the enforcement has picked up and has kind of maintained its course. Even 2019 was the last year for which numbers were made available. So you can see almost close to 29 million was used as a total sum for the civil penalties. When you look at the total number of settlements, the number of settlements has just increasing consistently over the period of years. And when we look at where the money is going, it's still 75-25, so to speak. So attorneys' fees is where, so all these private attorneys that are bringing cases on public's behalf, they are collecting most of the money that's being that's being collected is going to them. Civil penalties only like $5.5 million. So as you can see, just a small portion of the total penalty. Specifically looking at the live trend of what's going on for the past few months. So the trend that was there similarly continues on. Your lead and phthalates still tend to dominate the number of notices that are being served. However, in some instances, the other chemicals are also coming into picture. As you can see for March, there are a lot of other chemicals. Again, this is for food, which always tends to be the case. You've got acrylamide and some of these other chemicals for which they were serving. Now, you do get some of the other chemicals. But if you think about consumer products, non-food, non-personal care, food, lead and phthalates still tend to dominate the categories. Bags and cases, especially, even we've seen packaging for things like comforters and bedding, or even personal accessories where you have those transparent vinyl cases do tend to get targeted quite a bit. externally decorated glass and ceramic ware, tools, and especially tools that might have a vinyl handle tends to be targeted quite a bit as well. So these, this seems to be the case. And then, of course, off and on, you'll see gloves and things like that'll come into picture. The other one which we've seen is also smartphone cases, and smartwatch cases as well, which we'll see that for BPA or phthalates come into play as well. Similarly, when you look at April, again, you kind of see non-food. You see, lead and phthalates still being the big chunk of other products being targeted. April was unique in terms of, there are only like 156 notices, which is very unusual. Again, coming back to May, you kind of get back to that 250, 300, which tends to be the norm, for the 60-day notices that are served every month. Last month, it was, one of the things that we saw was, I think, power tools, and they were being targeted for not providing warning for wood dust. So that was another unique one where, we had seen that, a few years back, and then it just came back again for these type of power tools. So, it helps identify what some of the enforcement is that's being carried out in the marketplace, and hopefully it'll help you align in case if your product hasn't been targeted to be mindful and vigilant for those specific for substances. Settlements wise, Chrome 6, I mean, they've been targeted for leather by the CEH, the Center for Environmental Health, for footwear, gloves, and as well as, not just fashion gloves, but also for workwear and a lot of the other type of gloves as well. And CEH started it, but now there are many of the other attorneys that have also served 60 notices for those. There had been a settlement, and that there is no reformulation level. It's just basically they just require you to provide warning in case if you find Chrome 6. So, I mean, it would be worthwhile in case if you are making products that contain leather, especially in something that would be in prolonged contact with skin. So, you can kind of draw analogy. So if you have steering wheels, that you're selling steering wheel covers that you might be offering as a accessory or aftermarket sale, you can think it could be potentially next. Same thing, furniture, good leather furniture that would be in prolonged contact with skin, that could be targeted as well. So, hopefully this will help identify that once they do pick a product material and the exposure pathway, that they will move, as once they exhaust these product groups, they will move on to adjacent product categories. And so you can kind of use that same logic to think through and help mitigate before your risk before you get the served a 60-day notice. As I mentioned, it would be like auto accessories where it might be like a steering wheel or car seats that are sold aftermarket, which would be in prolonged contact with skin, furniture, or some of those things. You could also think about those adjacent product categories. BPA, so this was, as I mentioned, safe use determination. So this is a good tool for the the manufacturers or the industry to alleviate some of the pressure that might be there from Prop 65. So this was one that was issued last year by Office of Environmental Health Hazard. So essentially what safe use determination, SUD, is, where you as an industry can petition Office of Environmental Health Hazard to say, here is a chemical in specific product or product category, which would also define the exposure pathway and say, for this chemical from this product or product category, if the exposure would be from below this thresholds, then it would be below those safe harbor levels, and thereby if that determination is made, then it would imply that you don't need to serve a 60-day you don't need to provide a warning for the exposure. And so in this instance, the petition was requested by the Vision Council on behalf of its members that are the manufacturers or distributors that are offering these products for sale, and it was specifically for bisphenol A or BPA from the polycarbonate eyewear. It could be sunglasses, prescription glasses, OTC, reading glasses, any of those that were made by or distributed by the TVC members, right? So the key was polycarbonate. So it's very, very well defined scope. It's only for BPA, it's only for polycarbonate eyewear, and only for the companies that are part of the Vision Council, members of the Vision Council, whether they are manufacturers, distributors, or offering these products for sale. And so the determination was that if the extractable level of BPA using acetonitrile by LC-MS were below the threshold specified here, so below 25 micrograms per gram, from Temple 68 microgram per gram for nose pad, or 120 and 302 from frame and lens respectively, then it would imply that you don't need to provide warning. The key distinction here is as part of the safe use determination, all the legwork was done up front to establish that, hey, based on these content level, if BPA was present at this content, so it's essentially ppm at this content level, you don't necessarily, the exposure from these components would be below the safe harbor level, which are the NSRL or the MADL level, based on whether that substance is causing cancer or reproductive toxicity. So in this case now you can essentially perform a content analysis, which is a lot more easier and straightforward as compared to an exposure assessment, which gets pretty complex quickly. So again, let's say, for example, if some new chemical that is used widespread in this industry were to be listed, you as a manufacturer, or you can request the industry organization to request on behalf of various members to petition OEA for such safe use determination, which will definitely help the industry quite a bit. So the recent trends, as I mentioned, to look at those, latex workout bands, some of the nitrous amines were being targeted for those. So we've seen that come through in the past couple of months. As I mentioned earlier, BPA in smartphone and smartwatch cases that are made from polycarbonate are also getting targeted. And that would be across the board. I'd say, like, if you are using polycarbonate in specific products, that might be that might be in a component which would come in very prolonged contact or frequent contact with the consumer. It would be worthwhile to look at what are the potential mitigation strategies. And also, as I said, last couple of months we saw power tools being served 60-day notices for wood dust. So again, this is in addition to what we normally see for bags and cases and packaging material for BPA, and your tools and hardware for lead and so on and so forth. So this is kind of something that's unique. And also Chrome 6, that's been ongoing now in leather components or leather products that tend to stay in prolonged skin contact. So that's at least hopefully helps you see what's being enforced in the marketplace. In terms of as Prop 65, just like any other list, as it's like 900 plus chemicals right now, getting close to 1,000. That list gets periodic update, if you will. Many of it is through automatic mechanism. The OEA has various mechanisms for listing substances on Prop 65 list. Some could be based on their own determination. Sometimes if they get added to any of the authorized lists, then automatically they get added in here as well. And so the recent additions were indium tin oxide ITO and molybdenum trioxide. So ITO is like it's optoelectronic material that's used very heavily and widely in many electronic devices. So if you are using, as things become smarter, or you incorporate smart function in various component or products that you're manufacturing, it'd be worthwhile to see, are you using that? And, if there is going to be an exposure to that, that would warrant warning. Molybdenum trioxide is used, in manufacture of molybdenum metal, which of course goes into stainless steel. And so, when you're making those, you can kind of see intended use and potential exposure, whether it's there and if it's below the safe harbor level. So since they were listed, the way the Prop 65 work is, within the first year of listing, even if there is an exposure, you don't need to provide the warning. So any exposure that potentially can occur from up until March 19th of 2022, you wouldn't need to provide warning. Anything after that, if that exposure would be above the safe harbor levels, then you would need to provide a warning. So, you have time from now until next year, March, to figure out, are you using these substances? If so, where they are, what are the potential exposures, and would that, warrant a warning or not? Along with that, OEA has also proposed warning, which, just happened last month, or this month, beginning of this month, to list following 4 substances, which is the THF, the tetrahydrofuran, which is one of the solvents, which is used heavily, probably used in polymerization to make, elastomeric fibers. So spandex, you think about that. It's also used as in various PVC-based adhesives and varnishes. So it's used widespread. Some of the other acrylates, which are listed below, they are used as adhesives, also in manufacturing of textiles and polymers. So again, pretty widely used. So these substances were proposed to be listed or added to the Prop 65 list, and that as that proposal is still open for public comment. So in case if you have any specific feedback, you can provide to the Office of Animal Health Hazard up until July 26th. So the deadline is 26th of July. After that, OEA will again review, go through that process, and if they make a determination, they will add them. Once these are added, there's a 1-year transition time. So any exposure that occurs from the date of listing, the first year does not require warning, and after that, you would have to provide warnings. So just be mindful, these substances are used pretty heavily, and so you want to be very mindful of what the developments are as things move along. So looking at what the Prop 65, one of the common misconception is, why don't we say we meet Prop 65 or we are compliant with Prop 65? So it's, especially for manufactured products, it's very, very difficult to make that determination saying you are compliant with Prop 65, because there are, as I mentioned, close to 1,000 chemicals already, and that list is only growing, right? So you can foresee for manufactured products where you may not necessarily have all the information at the substance level, it's going to be very difficult for you to even know what's in the product, and then even if you have to understand how much of it is in there and what could be the potential exposure. So since it's challenging to know what all is in there, and also secondly, how much of not necessarily is in there, but also the exposure would be, it just makes that task that much more difficult. So instead of thinking about compliance with Prop 65, it's better to think about how can I mitigate my risk from getting the notice, 60-day notice for Prop 65, because again, it's most of the enforcement, 90%, if not higher, is by private attorneys, right? So in this instance, all you are trying to do is stay out of their radar to make sure that you don't you get hit by the 60-day notice. So you can think about what are all the product categories, what might be in your product, what substances are there, and also what are highly litigated. So you kind of follow the trends for enforcement as well to understand what would be your risk, because in order to mitigate it, you need to at least understand what would be the risk, right? So in terms of strategy, as I mentioned, one could be just label it, right? I mean, you can always label it, but then of course, for many products, it's not as easy, and also now where you have to be specific and identify at least one substance for the long form warning, that may not necessarily be as easy. Short form warning, as I said, it's so widespread use, and so if its use does get curtailed, that will also impact the brands and the retailers that are relying on those short form warning right now. So that could also have a significant impact. So labeling may not necessarily be a strategy that could work for everyone. For some instances, there may not necessarily be any other option but to label. So as I mentioned, like things where it's like a fireplace or fire pit or things like that where you're gonna burn. You don't have an option other than to label, or where you might have like a hardware where you have brass components that are accessible. You may not necessarily have an option. But things like children's products or some food contact materials, that may not necessarily be the most viable option, right? So in that case, how do you approach it, right? So in that case, you have to think about two things, right? What you're kind of think, is this what is going to be are there existing settlements? So you look at the enforcement-based strategy in terms of, are there settlements in code, out of code? Have there been 60-day notices? Because you can see the live trend of enforcement now, but if you're relying only on the settlements, it still would take like a year or two for that notice to move through the whole process and come out of the court system as a settlement, right? So you would lag by a year or two, and if you're relying only on settlements, you can potentially get targeted for those substances in those products. So it definitely helps to be vigilant and monitor the enforcement. Also proactively, you can definitely do risk-based testing. So based on the product, the material you can employ. Also, what the high-risk substances are when you're in non-food, non-personal care product categories. So you can also build that in to your portfolio for risk mitigation. And then finally, in case if there are substances where you have to use them and labeling is not really an option, you can definitely perform exposure assessment, or as I mentioned, safe use determination type of strategy where you can use your industry organization to request for that specific product substance a safe use determination, for which you would have to essentially perform exposure assessment, right? So you can at least have build this what is appropriate based on what your risk tolerances are. And then also, once you do have that, you need to also have the the people internally and externally identified in terms of who is going to deploy that strategy, right? So one is you make it and communicate that strategy. Second is, now once you have that, you have to figure out, in case if you're relying on testing or documentation, who is going to flag when warning is required. So right, if you're relying, let's say, documentation, and someone says, hey, my product contains this substance which is on Prop 65, and so you need to label. Who is going to draw that flag and put it, so that share that with the the PD team, product design development team, packaging team. Also, now we have the e-commerce as a platform. So who's going to convey that to the IT team so that it gets appropriately shared, not only in the stores but also online as well. So you have to identify all the stakeholders within your HQ, also part of the stores team, and also the IT team, right? So all of that needs to be conveyed. Make sure there are established standardized warnings that are being used wherever there are languages that are in addition to English. You also might need to do the translations, so having that built in. And then, as I mentioned, kind of communicate internally, externally, because you might be serving more than one role. You might be a manufacturer, importer, and also a retailer, or you would also be working for your products with some retailers. In that instance, you might have obligations to communicate with your external partners like a retailer, or you might have obligations to make sure that you have mechanisms to capture the communication that might be coming from your manufacturers. So having those roles identified, people in those instances, and then making sure that there is a communication process identified is extremely important, so that all the appropriate things gets flagged and also gets communicated properly. Another things is, as you get into all these chemical alphabet soups, and more chemicals get regulated, not only in the US but also internationally. There are other options like smart screening that you could deploy. So especially for apparel, footwear, and probably similar can be used for brands that are making products from these materials as well. You can definitely use what we call the chemical smart screening, where we screen for existence of nearly about 400 substances that are commonly found in some of these materials by single tests. And so that will help identify one, are these substances present, and in case if they are, at least what some of those levels might be. And then you can of course do a deep dive for specific substances that might be of interest to you, depending on the the risk mitigation strategy that you develop. And so this is a good filter along with your monitoring of enforcement trends to stay ahead of some of the potential of receiving a 60-day notice. So in summary, I'll just leave it saying, develop a strategy both for screening, which is for your product, as well as enforcement, so not only what is in your product but also what's being enforced, because at the end of the day it's all about what these attorneys, these bounty hunters essentially are looking for, because you want to stay ahead of them is what it is. Establish things in your supply chain to communicate based on what your role is, either externally, internally, and or both. Where it's required, perform exposure assessment or have warnings. And then kind of, it's one of those things where you just have to have a cadence, every quarter, every 6 months, because as we saw, the list keeps changing. The enforcement, of course, will look a little bit different from not necessarily month to month, but you can definitely see trends changing from quarter to quarter. So just be helpful to kind of keep track of that as well, and use that as a feedback loop into the plan that you formulated, so that it can be refined further to ensure that your risk doesn't increase. Right. So with that, Amy, I'll pass it back, and then we can answer any questions that are there.
Okay. Thank you, Pratik. We did have a number of questions come in. We have a few minutes to answer some of them, but we may not be able to get to all of them. The first question: are inaccessible components exempt based on exposure, or can a person be exposed because it will eventually be thrown away by the consumer and end up in a landfill?
Yes, I think so. Let me give a technical answer. So the Prop 65 doesn't address accessibility or inaccessibility explicitly, because the regulation talks about exposure, right? And since we saw exposure, as I alluded to, you have to think about the chemical itself, right? And I'll give 2 examples. So let's say, for example, you have something that is not volatile. So for example, lead, in a component that is inaccessible, and so would not be something that a consumer would touch during the product life cycle. So for that, your risk would be very low. But let's take a VOC like formaldehyde, and so even though the component, let's say it's a composite wood product, right, or something, or an adhesive or something like that, where the potential for that VOC is there to escape from the product, even though that component might be inaccessible. So in this instance, your exposure potential is there, even though the component would be inaccessible. So I would say it depends on the chemical as well. But for things like lead and phthalates, generally, I would say the risk for risk of enforcement from if they are in an inaccessible component would be very low.
Okay. What other language or languages are required on warning labels other than English?
So that depends. There is no. So the regulation requires only English, of course. And the reason I said it depends is because it depends on what other languages you communicated the quote unquote, the product information, consumer information. And so, for example, as I said, I'm here, so I see this conveyed in multiple languages. A lot of times when you're selling product in US and Canada, you have the information in English and French, right? So now at least you need to translate those warning labels in English and French. There's a huge Latino population in the state. And so you might have conveyed that information in English and Spanish. So now you also have to translate the warning labels in English and Spanish. I also seen the, and again, this is all anecdotal, but I've seen the information, the warning labels being translated in Vietnamese and Filipino. And again, this is my sampling from, San Francisco Bay Area, but I've seen languages in different languages as well, based on what the consumer information, product information is. And I mean, the Office of Environmental Health Hazard has these translations on their website. So it's not something that you need to go to a translator to, figure out what the translation would be. The Cal EPA through OEA has done all that legwork. It's just a question of you knowing what all additional languages the warning label needs to be translated in. Once you know that, you can grab the warnings from the OEA's website.
Okay. What is the reason that this new proposed short form warning cannot be used on websites or in catalogs?
So right now, so currently you can use a short form warning on the products, and if you're using the short form warning on the products, you can use those short form warnings through your e-commerce or catalog as a platform, right? Any other platform. The proposal is, and again, this is a proposal, so I want to be very clear that it's not finalized. It's still a proposal, is to limit the use of short form warning in itself, where it would be limited, in the product category and 5 square inches surface area and so on and so forth. So you could only use on those smaller products, and also the warning itself would have changed. So along with that, they're also proposing that the use of short form warning, even those revised one, not be allowed for the e-commerce or catalogs and require the use of full form warning. And again, this goes back to, the whole intent that the short form warnings are intended to be for smaller products where you don't have enough real estate to convey all this information. In theory, on a website or through your catalogs, the space shouldn't necessarily be any constraint. And so you should be able to convey the full warning in there, right? So again, this is my reading of it. It's not necessarily explicitly addressed. But again, this is a proposal right now. If you are using short form warning on products, you can use those short form warnings on the website for that exact same product, as well as for the catalogs for the exact same product.
Okay, related to the new proposal, do you know, or can you comment on how likely OEA will be to pass this into law?
Unfortunately, I don't really have the crystal ball for that one. I mean, it is something that they were very passionate about, and so, but also, industry group, as I mentioned, OEA did have a public comment, a meeting specifically for this as well, and so there was a good degree of feedback and opposition from the industry group and various manufacturers. So, at least the OEA knows that it's not something that's favorably looked upon by the industry, but probability-wise, unfortunately, I don't have that in terms of when or if or when that would come through.
Okay. For the 65 props, the 60-day notices, sorry. Does the food category cover just edible food, or does it also include food containers, kitchenware, kitchen and fridge organizers?
No, food is just purely food. So I mean, that would be like various spices or seafood or things of that nature. So food is just food. Dietary supplements is just dietary supplements. If let's say food contact product were to be targeted, we would list that separately.
Okay. Most steel has some nickel as an intentional alloy or residual element. Lead is added to various metals in small quantities in the range of 0.1 to 0.5%. Do these materials need a warning?
I mean, it really depends. And again, I mean, if Prop 65 was purely science and, health risk based, it would be very different conversation, right? In this instance, it's as we saw, as I showed in the penalty slide, most of it is basically where, some of these attorneys are bringing these cases forward to, get through to the civil penalty and collect money, right? So it's not necessarily health or science based. And also in this instance, the burden of proof is on the manufacturer or the importer and the retailer, right? So they have to show that if in this instance, for example, lead is at 0.1 or 0.5%, the exposure would be below the safe harbor levels, right? So that's the difficult aspect, and so that's why, as I even was talking about, the strategy saying is labeling, just label it. Can you just label it? And so in the instances where you have things like brass, where you have lead in a high proportion, it's almost easy to just label it rather than try to even determine, because the lead is there in a very high proportion. So it just might be worthwhile to label those type of things. So I would say in this instance, I mean, it really depends. You have to take it on a case-by-case basis. What is the product? What is the exposure? What are the exposure pathways? Based on that, your exposure potential, and make that determination.
Okay. The products need to be tested before a Prop 65 warning is put on packaging, or if the manufacturer saw that the product material listed on the Prop 65 website or the product contained the material, can they just put the Prop 65 warning on it?
Yes, I think the regulation, right, again, it doesn't really require any sort of testing. Testing, it's just a tool, right? Testing should not be, something that is the first time that you find out some things are there, right? In ideal case scenario, you should have information about the material and bill of material, or at least bill of substances, to understand what's going into the product. Or relying on documentation, right? So that would be the ideal case scenario. So testing is not required. Ideally, you should have that information based on, the bill of materials or the information about the materials from the manufacturer and the process that you're using. In case if you don't have that visibility, you can definitely use testing as a tool to figure out whether it contains lead or phthalates or some other substance, and in what amount, and then use that as your resource to determine whether or not a label is required. But warning, I mean, in the case of Prop 65, the regulation doesn't really require you to have testing in order to place warning. I mean, if you know that product is going to have these substances in there and the exposure would be high, then you can easily provide a label. And I've even seen in some instances where some companies just resort to labeling even without those type of due diligence, just to mitigate the risk of getting a 60-day notice. So ideally you should have the information, but I've seen at least in a couple of anecdotal incidents where I've seen people just label it just so that they don't receive a notice.
Okay, we have just a minute here. We have two questions related to wood dust and power tools. can you explain what chemicals wood dust can expose a person to? And then related to that, can you explain power tools and wood dust a little bit more? Is it because wood dust is produced by the use of a power tool?
Yes, I mean, wood dust in itself is listed on Prop 65 list. And so that's why anytime you would have that, you would have to provide a warning for it. And, and as part of the question, I know it was there saying, is the reason that, as when you use a power tool, it would create the wood dust? And the answer was yes, that was the reason why those, and again, I'm speculating, but that's probably the reason why it was served the notice is that, using those tools would create wood dust, for which the warning wasn't provided.
Okay, thank you, Pratik. We do have a couple other questions, but we have run out of time, so those questions will be addressed to the individuals who asked them directly. I'd like to thank Pratik for his time and expertise today, and just a quick reminder to everybody, this presentation was recorded, so you will receive an email in the next day or two with a link to the recording as well as a link to the slides presented today. Thank you again to Pratik, and thank you to everybody for attending today. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.